Do you know how many men like you I've already sent home? Eleanor Vance didn't turn her wheelchair away from the harbor window when she said it. Behind Daniel Cole, the office door was still swinging. The last one had walked out 10 minutes earlier, a young aide with a box of belongings and eyes too red to hide. Daniel set his bag down slowly. Said nothing. When Eleanor finally turned the chair to face him, something in her stopped cold, the way a person stops when they've met someone before and can't remember where. 8 weeks from now, she would owe this man more than her company. She just didn't know it yet. Stay with me to the end, there's a detail on that desk that won't mean anything until the very last scene. If you're new here, welcome to Storiez Tales. Subscribe, because you'll want to see how this one closes. The agency had warned him. 9 aides in 11 months. Some quit after a week. One quit after 4 hours and never came back for his coat. Daniel hadn't asked why. He needed the hours, the insurance, and a schedule that let him pick his daughter up from school by 3:45. And Vance Maritime paid enough that he didn't have to ask questions he couldn't afford the answers to. Eleanor Vance was 47 years old, and she had run a shipping empire from a wheelchair for 6 of those years without once asking the board to make it easy on her. Her assistant walked Daniel through the routine in clipped, rehearsed sentences. Physical therapy at 6:45. Correspondence review at 8. She did not like to be touched without warning. She did not like to be spoken to like a patient. She did not, under any circumstance, like to be helped unless she asked first. Daniel learned the rules fast and broke none of them. He learned the house too, without being told, which hallway carried sound, where the ramp had been built into a staircase that used to be grand and now just looked apologetic. He never mentioned it. He just moved through the house like a man used to memorizing terrain before anyone asked him to. Morning started at 6:30 in a converted sunroom, Eleanor working through resistance bands with a discipline that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with refusing to let her body decide what she could do without her permission. Daniel counted her reps in a flat voice and said nothing when her arms shook on the last set, because he understood, better than most, that pity was its own kind of insult. By the 3rd day, Eleanor had started testing him the way she tested all of them, with requests built to be unreasonable. Reschedule 4 calls in 10 minutes. Find a supplier contract from 4 years back with no file name. Stand in the doorway during a difficult call and show nothing on his face, no matter how sharp her voice got. Daniel did all of it without flinching and without offering an opinion she hadn't asked for. At noon, he stepped into the hallway to call his daughter. Homework first, then the tablet. I know it's boring. Do it anyway. He didn't know Eleanor could hear him through the half-open door until he turned and found her watching, her face unguarded for exactly as long as it took her to notice she was doing it. Your daughter, she said. Mia. She's 9. You call her every day. Every day I can. Eleanor looked away first. On the corner of her desk sat a small frame, turned face down, the kind of picture someone keeps but can't look at. Daniel noticed it because everything else on that desk was arranged with a precision that bordered on defensive, and that one object broke the pattern. He didn't ask. Not yet. What did you do before this? She said late that afternoon, watching him refill her water without touching anything else. Before wheeling rich women to meetings. Different kind of work. That's not an answer. Everyone who works for me has a resume I could recite in my sleep. Yours reads like it was written by someone trying not to be found. Maybe I was. She studied him a moment longer, then let it go, some instinct telling her this wasn't a door to force open. But she watched him leave that evening the way a person watches a door they're not sure will open again. And for the first time in longer than she could admit, she found herself hoping it would. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had stopped testing him the way she tested the others. She started testing him differently, staging a folder left open with a fabricated medication conflict, timed for the exact hour her real nurse was out. She watched from the corner of her eye as she described symptoms that weren't real, expecting hesitation, or panic, or the kind of overcorrection that gave people away. Daniel crossed the room before she'd finished the sentence, and something in the way he moved changed entirely, faster, lower, every careful politeness of the last week gone in an instant. He checked pulse points that weren't part of any home care training program. He asked questions in a sequence too precise to be guesswork, the kind of triage rhythm drilled into a person until it stops being a decision and becomes reflex. "There's no fever," he said finally, flat. "And there's no crisis. You made this up." Eleanor didn't deny it. "Who taught you that?" "The Marines." "Which part of the Marines checks a civilian's pulse like that?" He didn't answer right away, and the silence told her more than any resume would have. That night, after he left, she looked him up. A public service record, redacted in places, but enough: combat medic, field designation, commendations she didn't recognize the names of but understood the weight of. And a discharge date 4 years back with no explanation attached. The next morning she laid it open on her desk. "You don't work in home care," she said. "You survive it." Daniel looked at the blacked out lines a long moment before he answered. "Combat medic. 9 years. It's a job where you learn to keep people alive in places that don't want anyone alive." His hands folded in front of him, went still the particular way hands go still when a man is holding something down. "I left because I couldn't save the one person I needed to save the most." Something in his voice closed the subject before she could ask who. Eleanor didn't push, not because she wasn't curious, but because she recognized the shape of a wound she carried herself, and she knew what it cost to have someone poke at it before you were ready. For the first time since he'd started, she looked at him not as staff, but as a person carrying something as heavy as her own. Later that evening, Daniel noticed the small frame on her desk had shifted just enough for the edge of an old photograph to peek out from underneath. Eleanor's hand flattened it back down without a word, her jaw tight in a way that told him not to ask. He filed it away, the same way he'd once learned to file away things he wasn't ready to understand, not until he had every piece. The following Tuesday, Daniel drove Eleanor downtown to Vance Maritime's headquarters, a building of glass and old brick that had housed 3 generations of the family's shipping business. In the lobby, a man in a tailored suit fell into step beside them with the ease of someone who owned the floor. "Marcus Reed," he said, extending a hand. "Chief Operating Officer. You must be the new one." He said it the way a man refers to furniture he expects to be replaced soon. In the elevator, with Eleanor a few steps ahead, Reed lowered his voice. "How's she really doing?" "Sleeping, eating, managing the stress." "You'd have to ask her." "I'm asking you. Someone in your position sees things the rest of us don't." "Then you're asking the wrong person." Reed's smile thinned but held. "People in your position don't usually last long here, Mr. Cole. Something to keep in mind." He stepped off before Daniel could answer, leaving the sentence to sit there like a hand on the shoulder. Upstairs, the boardroom was already half full, 6 directors, folders open, faces arranged into the particular blankness people wear right before they say something unkind. "Quarterly numbers are strong," one director said, "but the board has concerns about continuity of leadership." "Given the circumstances." Eleanor didn't blink. "Say what you mean." Nobody did, not directly. They talked around the word incapacity for 30 minutes, dressing it up in language about optics and investor confidence. Eleanor answered every question with numbers, cold, exact, margins and contracts signed under her name, never once looking like she needed anyone in that room to like her. Daniel stood by the door, arms crossed, recognizing in her the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been proving herself for 6 straight years with no one standing behind her. "They do that every quarter," she said in the car afterward, staring out the window. "Some version of it. You handled it." "I always handle it." A pause. "That's not the same as it not costing anything." Daniel didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded once, the way you nod at someone who doesn't want to be told it's going to be okay, only that you heard them. Rain came in hard that Thursday, shutting half the city down by 5. Daniel's sitter for Mia got stuck behind a flooded underpass, and he made the call he hated making, the one where he had to choose between the job and his daughter. "Bring her here," Eleanor said, before he'd finished the sentence. It was the first time she'd used his first name. Mia arrived soaked to the knees, staring at the marble ceiling like she'd walked into a museum. She didn't look at the wheelchair carefully, guiltily, the way adults sometimes did. She just walked up to it. "Does it go fast?" "Faster than you'd think," Eleanor said. "Can I push it?" "No. But you can sit in my lap while I do." Later, while Eleanor answered emails and Mia dried her hair with a towel too big for her, Mia asked with the bluntness only a 9-year-old could manage, "Does it hurt, not being able to walk?" Eleanor held up a hand before Daniel could redirect the question. "Not the way you mean. It's more like learning a whole new language for the same sentences. Some days I forget I even need the translation." Mia considered this with total seriousness. "That's a good answer. I've had 6 years to practice it." Before they left, Mia pulled out a marker and drew a wheelchair with wings on it, sliding the paper across the table without ceremony. "So you can fly when the stairs are dumb." Eleanor held it a long moment, longer than a piece of paper should take to hold, and something crossed her face Daniel had never once seen there in 3 weeks of watching her run a company. "Thank you," she said, and set it on the corner of the desk, not the drawer, the desk, propped against the frame that was always turned face down. For the first time, the hidden past and the unguarded present sat side by side, and neither of them moved to hide either one. The insurance department's notice went out on a Monday, routine language for something that wasn't routine at all. A mandatory 7-year audit of fleet maintenance records, beginning with the oldest files on the schedule. Nobody in the building thought twice about it except one man, who read it 3 times, standing very still with the door closed. 6 years ago, as Vice President of Operations, Marcus Reed had delayed a mandatory brake inspection across the company fleet to hit a quarterly budget target, and buried the engineering memo that flagged the risk. It had gotten him a promotion that year. He'd been telling himself for 6 years that it didn't matter. Now the audit would reach back exactly far enough to find it. By evening, a different document was already being drafted quietly under a header that had nothing to do with fleet maintenance, a guardianship petition, dressed in gentle language about sustained psychological strain and a company that deserved stable leadership during a period of ongoing personal difficulty. Carol Whitfield, the family's private nurse, found the draft by accident on a shared printer queue. 11 years earlier, she'd run the emergency department where Eleanor was brought in the night of her accident, and something about the petition's date range made her stomach turn in a way she didn't examine too closely at first. She thought about a chart she'd been told, gently but firmly, not to finish writing that same night, by an administrator who mentioned, almost in passing, how much the Vance family had given the hospital that year. She said nothing to Eleanor yet. Only this, standing in the doorway, "Be careful who you trust on that board. Not all of them are as loyal as they act." "Which one?" Eleanor asked. Carol didn't answer. That night, Daniel found Eleanor at the window near midnight, her chair turned toward the dark shape of the river, the lights of Harrow Bridge strung out over the water like something from a dream she couldn't wake from. "You're not going to bed?" "I don't sleep well when it rains." He was quiet a moment. "Something happened on that bridge." Her hand tightened on the armrest. She didn't answer that night. But she didn't tell him to leave, either. 3 nights later, without warning, she told him. About the rain 6 years ago, about driving alone across Harrow because her own car was in the shop, about brakes that failed without warning and a guardrail that gave way like paper. "There was a man," she said. "A stranger. He was already in the water before I understood what was happening. He did things to keep me alive that I didn't understand until much later. And then he was gone before anyone else arrived. Nobody ever found out who he was. I spent the first year convinced I'd dreamed him." Her hand went to the drawer, and this time she didn't stop herself. She lifted the frame and turned it over, finally, after 6 years, and set it on the desk between them, a photograph, blurred, taken from the far end of the bridge, showing the back of a man carrying a woman up out of the mud, water streaming off both of them in the glare of emergency lights. Daniel went very still. On the man's forearm, faint but unmistakable even in the grain of a bad photograph, was a unit crest he'd carried on his own arm for 9 years. Before he could speak, the door opened. Carol stood there, staring at the photograph, then at Daniel, then back again. "I recognized him the first week," she said quietly. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't allowed to. I was the nurse on duty the night they brought you in, Eleanor. I treated him too, off the record, in the hallway, before he disappeared out the side entrance. A gash on his forearm he wouldn't let anyone log. I've known for 3 weeks and I couldn't find the courage to tell you." Eleanor looked up at Daniel. "Is it you?" He didn't answer with words. He crossed the room, knelt beside the chair so they were level, and nodded once, slow, a confession 6 years in the making. "I wasn't out for a walk that night," he said, still kneeling. "I was driving to the hospital. My wife, Laura, she'd been sick a long time. Cancer. That night things had turned fast, and I was 40 minutes out when I saw your car go through the rail. I didn't think. I just went in. Did what I was trained to do, kept you breathing until the paramedics could take over. Then I left before anyone could stop me, because every minute I spent answering questions was a minute I wasn't with her." He looked at his own hands. "I made it, but not in time for the decision they needed made about her surgery. My sister had to make it instead. Laura held on 3 more years. I've never been sure if those 40 minutes changed anything for her, and I'll never know. I'm alive because of those 40 minutes, Eleanor said. I don't know how to carry that next to what it cost you." "You don't carry it," Daniel said. "We do. Together, or not at all." Something in Eleanor's face gave way. 6 years of armor she'd built around never needing anyone. "I built a whole life around not needing anyone," she said. "And it turns out the reason I'm alive to build it is a man who needed someone he couldn't get to in time. That's not a debt, Daniel. I don't have a word for it yet." 3 days after the discovery, a small leather journal turned up among the late Walter Vance's personal effects, forwarded to Eleanor by the estate attorney as part of a routine document sweep. Her father had died 2 years before the accident, but tucked inside, dated 8 months before his death, was a single entry Eleanor had never seen, a note about a decorated corpsman named Cole he'd once tried, quietly and unsuccessfully, to recruit onto the company's private security detail, calling him the kind of man who runs toward things the rest of us are trained to run from. Walter never knew how much that instinct would matter one day. Eleanor read it twice, then set it beside the photograph on her desk, and understood that her father had seen something in Daniel long before either of them had a reason to need it. If Carol had been told to hide what she saw 6 years ago, someone had given that order. And if someone at the company had delayed the maintenance that caused Eleanor's brakes to fail, that person was still walking around a building with her name on it. Daniel and Eleanor spent the next several nights cross-referencing maintenance logs against the fleet vehicle she'd driven that night, building a timeline neither of them had wanted to need, her hand occasionally brushing his over the same page. 3 days later, Marcus Reed brought the guardianship petition formally before the board, framing it as a reluctant duty forced on him by devotion to the company. For the first 10 minutes, watching the directors nod along, it almost worked. Then Carol stood. "I was the charge nurse the night Eleanor Vance was brought into my emergency room. The injuries I documented were consistent with total brake failure, not driver error. I was told by hospital administration that language to that effect should not appear in the final chart, given the size of the Vance family's contributions to that hospital. I've carried that instruction for 6 years. I'm done carrying it." Daniel stepped forward next, a folder in his hand. "This is a maintenance authorization log from 6 years ago. It shows a scheduled brake inspection for the company fleet, postponed under a signature I've cross-checked against current personnel files." He set it on the table. The signature is Marcus Reed's. Reed's composure didn't crack all at once. It went piece by piece, a denial too fast, a correction that contradicted the denial, a third explanation that contradicted both. The directors who had spent the morning ready to strip Eleanor of her authority spent the rest of it watching Reed instead, the way a room watches a man they've just realized they never knew. Eleanor didn't say much. She didn't need to. "I built this company back from the day my father couldn't anymore," she said. "I did it from this chair, in this voice, with no one behind me most of the time. I'm not asking this board to decide whether I'm capable. I already have been, for 6 years, while the man across this table was hoping I never found out why I was in this chair at all." The board voted down the petition before the hour was out. It wasn't close. That evening, Reed caught Daniel alone in the parking garage. "You've made an enemy today," he said, the friendliness gone entirely. "A man in your position, no real standing here, a kid to think about, should consider how easily a story like yours gets rewritten. Unstable veteran inserts himself into a vulnerable woman's life, feeds her a fabricated connection to a 6-year-old accident for sympathy. It writes itself, Mr. Cole." Daniel didn't move. "You threatened my daughter." "I mentioned her. There's a difference. I've had people point actual weapons at me and mean it less than you just did." Daniel opened his truck door, unhurried. "You should have spent the last 6 years fixing what you broke instead of hiding it. Now you don't get to choose how this ends." The next morning, Daniel brought everything he had to Eleanor's attorney, recorded conversations from 2 former aides Reed had quietly pressured out of the household, financial records showing payments routed through a shell vendor to bury a whistleblower complaint filed 3 years earlier, and Reed's own words from the parking garage, saved from the moment Daniel understood what kind of man he was dealing with. The board reconvened by noon. Eleanor laid it out herself, page by page, without raising her voice once, because by then she didn't need to. The recording played in a room gone completely silent. Nobody defended him. The vote to remove Marcus Reed as chief operating officer passed unanimously, with the maintenance cover-up findings referred to federal insurance investigators. He didn't argue. He buttoned his jacket the way a man does when he still wants to look like he's in control of something, and walked out ahead of security. Eleanor crossed the lobby afterward on her own power, chin level, and for the first time in 6 years didn't wait for anyone to open the door for her. The people who had watched her prove herself for 6 straight years finally understood they were watching something they should have recognized a long time ago. Mia was waiting by the elevators, and the moment she saw her father, she ran the last 10 feet into his arms. Eleanor watched them a second too long, something open crossing her face, the same look Daniel had once caught through a half-open door and never forgotten. "You did that," Daniel said quietly. "We did that," Eleanor said, and her hand found his on the armrest, brief, unhurried, the kind of touch that didn't need a sentence attached to mean something. 3 weeks later, Eleanor asked Daniel to drive her somewhere she hadn't been in 6 years. Harrow Bridge in late afternoon light looked nothing like it had that night, dry pavement instead of driving rain, the low sun turning the river gold instead of black. Mia ran ahead along the walkway chasing gulls, her laughter bright and ordinary against a place that had once held nothing but the worst night of 2 lives. "I used to think I'd never come back here," Eleanor said. "You don't have to stay long." "I want to." She reached into her bag and held out the old photograph. "I kept this because I needed a name for the person who saved me. Now I don't need the photograph. I have you." Daniel folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket instead of handing it back, and neither of them explained why that felt like the right thing to do. "What happens now?" he asked. "With the company. The investigation. The federal auditors will take a year to say what everyone already knows. I'll spend the next few years fixing what he broke instead of pretending the chair was the only thing he ever cost me." She looked out at the water. "But that's tomorrow's work. I didn't bring you here to talk about tomorrow. I wanted the last time I came here to mean something better than the first." Mia's voice carried up the walkway, calling for them to come look at something in the water, and Eleanor laughed, a real one, nothing guarded in it at all. Daniel released the brake on her chair and walked beside her, matched to her pace without either of them trying to be. They stood at the rail together as the sun dropped lower over the harbor, Mia between them pointing at a heron picking through the shallows, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all, because nothing needed saying. Neither of them said the word love that afternoon. They didn't need to. The bridge that had taken 6 years from her, and 40 minutes that never stopped costing him, had finally given something back, quietly, without ceremony, in the shape of two people walking the same direction at last. Neither of them had been looking for this. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Velvet Storiez Tales for more stories like it.